Thank you, Jamie. I've had 18 months I've known about this award, and I still don't think I've managed to come up with good words to describe just how lucky and grateful I feel to receive this award. I can honestly say I never thought I'd win a BACN prize at any point in my career. And I feel very lucky to be here today, particularly to present in person, something that seemed unimaginable just a few months ago. So the title of my talk today is Can I Be Bothered? The Neural and Computational Mechanisms Underlying the Dynamics of Effort Processing. And what I'm going to do in this talk is really give you an overview of 4 different strands of my research that I've been doing to look at motivation, the brain mechanisms that underlie motivation, how people vary in motivation, and what context our motivation changes in. It's going to be a very much an overview. So for those of you who maybe have a preference for a bit more detail, then please feel free to ask me questions afterwards. This is in person. I can't get away from your questions by pretending I have a bad Wi-Fi signal or press leave and simply evacuate the building. Okay, so my research then is really focused on motivation, and there's 2 symptoms that I'm particularly interested in, which are apathy and fatigue. And so apathy, which is classically defined as this reduction in goal-directed behavior. It's not due to a loss of pleasure. It's not anhedonia. We still like doing things, and it's not because we feel too exhausted to engage in behaviors. It really is a sort of loss of this willingness or being bothered to engage in behaviors. And that has a similar behavioral consequences to fatigue, which is we stop doing activities, but clearly fatigue has a different underlying cause. It's this pervasive feeling of exhaustion that leads to us being unwilling or unable to engage in behaviors. And these are both states that we've probably all been familiar with at some point. It's towards the end of the day, maybe you're feeling a little bit fatigued. Maybe some people aren't in this room and felt a bit apathetic for coming to my talk. It's fair play to them. But then in a more severe form, these are some of the most common symptoms across psychiatry and neurology. For instance, I'm showing data here from Hussein and Reuser a few years ago, and showing the proportion of patients who have a neurological condition who also get diagnosed with a severe form of apathy. And you can see across all of these different clinical conditions, apathy is highly common. And it's the same story across a number of psychiatric conditions, and the same story for when we look at fatigue. And so the aim of my research is to try and use computational methods to build better frameworks for understanding motivation, why people vary in motivation, and then why motivation can go wrong in neurological and psychiatric disorders. And to do that, I have built my research around the problem of how we make effort-based decisions. And the reason for that is that both apathy and fatigue have been associated with disruptions in effort processing. Both apathy and fatigue come with this when we're deciding whether to engage in a behavior. People with apathy and fatigue inflate the effort costs. They weigh that more in their decisions. And that means when it comes down to it, they're just less willing to engage in behaviors, or less able to, because they associate the behaviors with higher amounts of effort. And so if we can maybe use effort-based decision-making as a way to probe apathy and fatigue. And if we look at the systems in the brain that seem to be linked to the impairments of apathy and to fatigue, and to those that are involved, seem to be engaged in healthy people in making effort-based decisions, there's a considerable amount of overlap. So it seems that these dopaminergic projections from the midbrain, from the ventral tegmental area to the ventral striatum and up to cortical areas such as the anterior cingulate cortex, the anterior insular, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are associated with both of these conditions, and also to just making effort-based decisions in healthy people. So perhaps by understanding the computations that go into effort-based decision-making and people's willingness to engage in effortful behaviors, we might be able to get a better handle on what the impairments to motivation are in fatigue and apathy. So how can we go about doing that? Well, the way we really probe effort-based decision-making is typically giving people experiments where we get them to make decisions about whether they're willing to put in effort to obtain reward. So imagine I give you an experiment where I get you to squeeze a grip force device really hard at the start, and then I tell you there's going to, during the experiment in different trials, you're going to be asked to put in different percentages of your maximum grip strength in order to obtain rewards. When we do that kind of experiment, what you find is that people find the more effort, more grip force aversive. They find it a cost, and that tends to make them less willing to engage in the higher amounts of grip force behaviors. And so this process is referred to as effort discounting. The idea is that if I gave you £2 and then looked at the different amounts of force in that experiment, that the higher levels of force, people think it's not worth it. They're simply not willing to engage in that behavior. So they'd rather do something else rather than choose to do that trial. For more motive, we can look at use this to try and quantify differences between people in motivation. So if I gave £2 to this person, you can see that for some levels of effort, it's worth it. Sometimes they think it's not worth it. But if I take another participant, maybe a more apathetic participant, £2 is basically never worth it. That amount of money, there's no effort that I'm never willing to do. And of course, this varies with the magnitude of rewards. So take that more motivated person, £10, any amount of effort, always going to do that behavior. But the person who is less motivated, now £10, yeah, it's worth it more. I'm more likely to engage in that behavior. But still, there's levels of effort for which I just don't think it's worth it. Now, we can quantify these kind of effort-based decisions using simple computational models. We call these models effort discounting models. And a simple example is one you can see here, which is a parabolic discounting model, which simply says that the reward that's offered on trial, which is R in that equation, is discounted by the effort. In this case, it's the effort squared, which is the E there. But within these models, we can fit a parameter that explains a participant's choices across the whole experiment. So this parameter is going to be different for one participant than another, that can quantify how willing that person is to exert effort for reward over the course of the experiment. And so that allows us to nicely quantify a more motivated participant from a less motivated participant, based on using this equation to summarize all their decisions that they make about whether to put in effort to obtain reward. And the nice thing about these kind of computational models is they can allow us to look at hidden processes in the brain that we might be able to understand just by looking at whether they chose A or B. And they can do that using model-based fMRI. So basically, we take the different variables from these equations, so subjective value, SV, reward, R, and E. We can take those and look at when people are making a decision, where in the brain does activity correlate or co-vary with the different magnitudes that those variables take on across the course of the experiment. Okay, that maybe sounds relatively simple, but of course, effort is much more complicated than that. And the reason is that effort costs are not really always the same thing. They're not always static. Sometimes things can be cognitively effortful, but not particularly physically challenging, and some people might find that aversive. Some things can be really physically effortful, physically challenging, but not have huge cognitive demands. Sometimes we have to put in effort into social situations. Maybe we need to cooperate or compete with people, or sometimes we might need to just, as Marco was showing in that last talk, think really hard about somebody else's mental states and differentiate them from ourselves. And that might be a really effortful process. So there's different types of effort and different situations we have to exert it. The other is that effort isn't always going to be a linear process. As I showed in the past slide, sometimes effort might be parabolic, sometimes it might have a linear effect, sometimes it might have a hyperbolic. So different types of task, might have different associated efforts with them that might lead to different shapes to the influence of effort on our willingness to exert it. And the last thing that I've looked at in my research is the fact that motivation isn't static from one moment to the next. This is a picture of my cat looking very motivated, stressing out his cat dad. And here's the same cat a few minutes later. Clearly, in one of these situations, very motivated. Clearly, in the other, not. So this makes understanding effort processing quite challenging. We have to understand different types of effort and how the cost of that effort changes from one moment to another. And so across this talk, I'm going to talk about the 4 different strands of work that I've done to try and look at all of these different problems using computational modeling and predominantly fMRI. So the first strand was some work I did with a colleague and friend, Trevor Chong, back when I was in Oxford, where we wanted to look at how people might evaluate and decide to put in different types of effort. So as I mentioned before, that some tasks can be really cognitively effortful, but other tasks can be very physically effortful. And so what we wanted to do was come up with an experiment where we might have 2 different tasks. One where we give people something that increases in cognitive demand, but the physical costs remain constant, and another that does the opposite. The physical demands increase, but the cognitive demands across all those levels of that task will be relatively constant. And so we came up with a task that I'll describe only very briefly here, happy to go into details afterwards, where one task where people were trained on extensively before they went in the scanner, where what they had to do was fixate on a stream of letters and numbers, but fixate centrally. But from time to time, they'd have to detect targets on one side or the other, and they'd have to make peripheral switches of attention. So keep fixating centrally, but detect targets on one side or the other across a 14-second period. Now, there were always the same number of targets, but what they had to do was switch their attention from time to time through an additional cue in the middle of the screen. So across these 14 seconds, we could vary the amount of peripheral switches of attention that people had to make. So between 1 and 6. So we could vary how difficult or effortful it was going to be during each trial. And self-report data confirmed that people did find more switches of attention more effortful. So they were trained up extensively on this task by showing them a cue, such as the pie chart that you can see there, which indicated how many switches of attention there would be in that trial. If they then performed accurately at the task, they then get a credit, and all participants were in fact over 90% accurate on all trials. And we then tried to match that to a physically demanding task, where, as I mentioned before, we gave people a grip force device, we got them to squeeze it as hard as they can, and then we set different percentages that they had to sustain across that 14-second period to obtain a reward. So here, the physical demand increases as the amount of force they had to put in increased, but the cognitive demands was pretty similar, just maintain a level of grip force. So they were trained extensively on those two tasks, and then inside the MRI scanner, we got them to do decisions about whether they were willing to engage in a level of difficulty of each task for different magnitudes of reward. And so what they had to do was make a choice between what we call a baseline, which was always 1 credit, so a very low reward, but it was always the easiest version of that task. So 1 switch for the cognitive task and the lowest level of force for the physical effort task. And they chose between that and a variable offer that was always higher in terms of the level of difficulty of the task, so more attentional switches or more grip force, but also was higher in credits between 2 and 10 credits. And so what we can do is use people's decisions separately on these cognitive trials and these physical trials to see whether how people make choices on, to engage in cognitively or physically demanding tasks, and whether they use similar or distinct computations to do this. So the first thing we can see is here I'm showing it's the proportion with which people accepted the higher effort offer. Now what you can see is the amount of demand of the task, both the cognitive task in blue and the physical task in red. As the demand increased, as the effort level increased, people were less willing to choose it. So they're clearly discounting the rewards by the effort in both tasks. But there was no significant difference between the two tasks. So overall, people are discounting the rewards by the effort, but equally for the cognitive and physical task. But then what we could do is fit different computational models to see 2 things. One, is there a similar shape of effect of the effort in these 2 tasks? I mentioned before, it could be linear, it could be parabolic, it could be hyperbolic. But also we can see whether a model that has separate parameters on the cognitive and physical trials, or 1 parameter across the 2, is the best at explaining their choices. And when we performed a model comparison, you can see here is the BIC scores. I'm going to go over this very quickly, but the winning model had different equations for cognitive and physical trials, and we needed different parameters to explain their choices on both types of trials. And in particular, what we found is that the cognitive effort task was hyperbolically discounting the rewards, whereas the physically effortful task was parabolically discounting the rewards. So even though at the group level, participants' behavior is matched, they're equally willing to engage in it at the level of the group, at the level of an individual participant, some of them were more willing to engage in the physically effortful task, and some were more willing to engage in the cognitively effortful task. And that's why we need separate parameters to explain their choices. And also the shape of the effect of the effort was different across these 2 types of tasks. Okay, so now turning to the fMRI results, I'm just going to show the highlight, which is that broadly speaking, the only real thing we could find was a domain general system that signaled the subjective value we took from those computational models of both types of effort. So activity in this anterior cingulate medial prefrontal region, in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and in the anterior insular signaled subjective value on every trial of this task. So the rewards minus the effort, but it did so for both the cognitive task and the physical task. And you can see that when I plot the parameter estimates from these areas here. So this is the degree to which activity in these regions signaled subjective value on the cognitive trials in red and physical trials in blue. And you can see on both sets of trials, activity in these regions is scaling with subjective value. So that suggests that this set of regions might just be engaged in deciding to exert effort based on how rewarding the effort's going to be and how costly the effort's going to be, regardless of the nature of the effort that we're going to have to exert. And the next strand of my research builds a little bit upon this and has been work that I've done with long-standing collaborator Prosocial Lockwood, where we got really interested in the fact that in these kind of experiments, you're putting in the effort and you get the reward. But in the real world, we often have to make decisions about whether we're willing to put in effort for other people's benefit, whether it's helping out a colleague with their work or even just holding open the door for the person behind you. In those situations, you are deciding whether to put in effort or not, but somebody else gets the immediate benefit of walking through the door without having to put in effort in themselves. And so what we wanted to do is come up with an experiment where people were making effort-based decisions, but they were going to do so for either their own benefit or for somebody else's benefit. So what we called to look at, the process we call this is prosocial motivation, putting in effort for other people's benefit. And so we have this task where it's very similar to the previous one. On each trial, they're going to be presented with a choice between resting, which required no effort, but would give them only a very low reward of 1 credit, or working. And the work offer varied on every trial in terms of how much physical effort would be required, again, percentages of their maximum grip strength, and also in terms of the magnitude of reward that would be on offer. But the key difference in this experiment was on half the trials, they made the decision, they put in the effort, and then they got the credits that would increase their bonus payment at the end of the experiment. But on the other half of the trials, they would make the decision, they would put in the effort, but the rewards would be delivered to an anonymous other person who was situated outside the scanner. And they never met this person apart from waving in rubber gloves other side of the door. So it's a bit weird. I can talk about that afterwards. But they knew no other information about this person other than the gender matched name. So they don't know any characteristics of this person. So using this task, we can look at the choices people make and see whether people value and are willing to put in effort equally for self and other, to see whether people are more or less motivated in engaging self-benefiting or other benefiting behaviors. So the first thing we can do is perform a model comparison and again, see whether we need separate equations and parameters to characterize people's decisions on those 2 types of trials. Now, what we find is that a parabolic discounting model, the same as we showed for the physical evidence in the previous study, is the best fitting to people's choices. But we needed separate discounting parameters on self and other trials, reflecting the fact that people weren't valuing, even though the effort is always the same in this experiment, people weren't as willing to put it in when for self and for other. And if we just look at the proportion of choices people made of the higher effort offered, again, as a function of the amount of effort that was required on that trial, we can see that at the lower effort levels, people are pretty willing to exert effort for others almost as much as they're willing to put in effort for themselves. But at the higher effort levels, people have discounted the rewards much more, and they're much less willing to engage in the behavior when somebody else is going to benefit compared to when they're going to. And we call this phenomenon prosocial apathy, so it's just a reduced willingness to do prosocial activities compared to self-benefiting ones. Now, that's a bit pessimistic, especially after a pandemic. We need good news. And there is some, which is related to Joe Cutler's talk that we heard this morning, which is that older adults seem to be a little bit different when it comes to making these decisions. So we did another experiment where older adults, we got a group of older adults perform the task and a group of younger adults. And we can then look at their discounting rates, the degree to which they discount the rewards for self and for other. Now, previous research had suggested that older adults are perhaps more pro-social based on the fact that they donate more to charity and often volunteer more frequently for charity. And there's some economic gains where they show they're willing to give up more money in order to do benefits for other people. But the problem with that is that older adults might have more money and sometimes have more time on their hands if they're retired than perhaps the average person in their 20s does. But with this task, the time is matched and the money is always for self or for others. So there's no benefit to yourself or not to not engaging in the behaviors on other trials separately from the self. And so what we can do here is look at the discounting parameters for self and for other. And the key result here is on that right-hand side, which is the fact that the older adults had a lower discounting parameter, reflecting that they were much more willing to put in effort for the other person in this task compared to the younger adults. Sorry to the younger members of the audience, but maybe work harder. Yeah. So that suggests, therefore, that although people are generally a little bit selfish when it comes to putting in effort, perhaps that's not always the case. And so more recently, we did an fMRI study looking at this task. And what we wanted to do was look at activity in the brain to see whether there might be domain general effects, as we saw in the previous study, or whether there might be some specific systems in the brain that are involved in motivating prosocial acts. And in brief, what we found was that when we looked at activity, when people were making those effort-based decisions for self or for other, is we found the same system that we found in the previous study, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the anterior insular, in which activity was covariant with the subjective value, both on self trials and on other trials. So whether you were benefiting from the action or somebody else was, this system was calculating whether it was worthwhile engaging in that behavior. But intriguingly, we also found a region that seemed to be coding something specifically on other trials. And in particular, what we found was this region lying in the anterior cingulate gyrus. So this is a separate subregion of the cingulate cortex from what you can see on the left-hand side, in which activity was covariant with the effort that was required on a trial, but only on other trials for the other person, not on self trials. So this region seemed to be coding the cost or how much effort was going to be required for a prosocial act, but not for self-benefiting ones. So that suggests that there is some domain generality when it comes to being prosocial compared to being self-benefiting, but also there might be some specialized area of the brains. I want you to put that brain area in one of your working memory slots because it's going to come back in a second. So the next strand of my research I want to talk about is something that I actually got interested in back in my undergraduate days, which is how do we track other people's motivation? So I'm going to show you those two pictures, and there's a couple of inferences that you're going to make. The first is, God, wow, this guy really likes cats, and you're not wrong. The second is that looking at these two pictures, you're able very easily to infer that one is much more motivated than the other. My cat on the bottom, lazy. Cat on the top, he's got a lot of energy, right? He's being very goal-directed. And this is something we can actually very easily do all the time. We don't necessarily have to represent complex things about people's mental states, but we are constantly observing other people, thinking about other people, and able to infer how motivated that person is. Based on their traits or based on other factors that we see, we're able to think about just how invigorated is someone's actions going to be at any point in time. And in my PhD, I suggested that that cingulate gyrus region that we saw previously might actually be an important region for this process. And part of the reason for that was that its connectivity profile suggested it received all the kinds of information you might need to think about how motivated someone is. So it's connected to areas of the brain that we know process reward-related information. It processes affective information. It receives input from areas of the brain that are important for understanding other people's mental states. And it also receives input and is connected to areas of the brain that are known to process other people's actions. So if we put all those things together, I mean, it's pretty flaky evidence, but it suggests that this brain area might be important for putting those things together to understand how motivated another person's going to be. And some work back in 2006 from Pete Rudbeck and colleagues showed that if you lesion that light blue area in the cingulate gyrus there, it impaired social information processing. But if you lesioned the cingulate sulcus, very adjacent brain, the next just adjacent brain region, it had no impact on social information processing. So that suggests again that this brain area might be really important for processing information about others. And if you actually look at the connectivity fingerprint that Neubert colleagues did back in 2015, you can see now shown in lime green to make it a bit complicated, but that area in lime green is the cingulate gyrus, and it has a completely different connectivity fingerprint from any other region of the medial frontal cortex. And so during my PhD, I suggested that then can we build a computational account of how this brain area might process other people's motivation? And all I really suggested was that this brain area was doing something very similar to what we do when we motivate our own behavior. It thinks about the benefits, but now the benefits for another person. And it thinks about the costs, but not the cost to me, the cost for that person. Because if I work out all of those things and do some sort of discounting process, I'm going to know how motivated another person is going to be. And in 2016, with Matthew Rushworth and Steve Chang, I put forward this horrendously complicated, ugly-looking figure, which was included all of the different computations that I thought might be important for going into that process. But the neat thing about this is it allows us to make some quantitative predictions about what a brain area's response will be based on the effort, the benefit, and people's motivation. So we can therefore use it to sort of understand what might be happening in a brain area that's tracking other people's motivation. But the key idea is this is a very simple process. We just think about the benefits for other people, we think about the costs for other people. And then when we see that that's different from what we expected, we use some kind of prediction error process to update that over time. So constantly tracking how motivated another person is. And over the years, I've shown that actually there was lots of evidence that the singular gyrus might be the brain area that's important for this, along with some work of collaborators and colleagues. So firstly, it's been shown that this region responds to cues that signal how rewarding something is going to be for somebody else, but not for ourselves. It signals similar information about pain for other people, but not for ourselves. It signals the net value of actions for other people. So how effortful an action will be for somebody else versus how rewarding it will be. But again, not that information about ourselves. And it also signals prediction errors when something unexpected happened in terms of the outcomes of somebody else's action, i.e. a moment when you know that somebody else is going to be updating their expectations and their motivation subsequently. So putting this together, it suggests the ACCG might actually fit with that computational model that I put forward. And this might be useful for understanding disorders where social cognition may go awry. So, for instance, in collaboration with Josh Balsers and colleagues, we showed that whilst in typical people, developed adults, we find a signaling of prediction errors in this region when something happens specifically for the outcomes of somebody else's decision, but not our own. But in high-functioning autistics, we found a blunting of this socially specific prediction error signal. And the degree of this blunting correlated with their social symptom severity, according to clinical diagnostic scales. So this ACCG region might be important for tracking other people's motivation, and it might be a region that, when its computations go awry, might be responsible for some aspects of how we struggle to understand other people. So the last area of my research that I want to talk about is from work that I have started much more recently, particularly with my PhD student, Tanya Muller. And this comes back to the point I made before, which is that motivation changes from one moment to the next. We aren't always equally willing to do the same kinds of behavior. And fatigue is one thing that causes a massive change in our motivation or our ability to perform tasks. This isn't a new idea. We can go back over 100 years to show that if you give someone a really hard version of a task versus an easier version of a task, people's performance declines more rapidly for the hard version versus the easier version. And it's been shown for cognitive tasks, physical tasks, and so on. But actually, we have quite a poor understanding of the computations that go into these changes in behavior. And so what we've been trying to do is build a computational account of how fatigue might fluctuate moment to moment and how that might feed into changes in performance on tasks. And we're going to suggest that that happens because fatigue changes your motivation by changing your cost benefit or effort-based decisions. And then we can look for whether those regions of the brain that we know are important for making effort-based decisions are also susceptible to this fluctuating fatigue, according to our model. Now, I'm not going to put up equations because it's the end of the day, and good Lord, none of us need to see equations. What I'm going to do is just show you a schematic of what our model does and the different parameters in it and what they do. So if we were going to build a model of fatigue, we might assume that, it is a change in your internal states that we sense or feel as a sensation of fatigue. And existing work suggested that this has at least two different factors within it, which have different features to them. So one of the factors is the fact that doing a task for a long period of time causes a sensation of fatigue to build that just won't go away with rest. We've all done this. We've done tasks with participants. We give them breaks and they come back and they're still doing rubbish. So there's an unrecoverable component to fatigue. It might be that you need to have some sleep or some food or something in order to restore your performance to the same level. But there's also a recoverable component, which is that When you put in effort, your fatigue goes up, but also when you take a period of rest, your fatigue comes down a little bit. And so we have three parameters in our model that characterize those three different aspects of fatigue: the amount that effort increases your recoverable fatigue, the amount that rest decreases it, and an extra parameter that deals with that unrecoverable, just gradual build. And this fluctuates constantly and feeds into an effort discounting model, such that now, rather than these different curves representing different people, they represent the same person at different points in the experiment. So these curves are now constantly fluctuating around. When you're really fatigued, suddenly amounts of effort and reward that you were definitely going to work for before, now just not worth it. So our model therefore deals with this constant fluctuation of your motivation, which might explain your changes in performance of a task. So to test this, we just did another very similar effort-based decision-making task. We got people to make choices between taking a rest and putting in more effort for more reward. Again, it was using grip force. I mean, in simple ways, we can analyze this. We can say, well, what do people's choices change over the course of the experiment? And what I'm plotting here is the proportion of choices that people chose to work versus rest at the different levels of effort and the different levels of reward. What you can see is that it's subtle, particularly on that screen. It looks really subtle. It's subtle, but there's some decrease in people's motivation. The lower levels of reward and the higher levels of effort, people are choosing to work less often than they are in the second half of the experiment than they were in the first. So some indication that people's motivation is changing. But what we can do is perform a model comparison to say, well, can we actually track trial by trial changes much more precisely? And do they reflect our recoverable and unrecoverable fatigue? And so what we did is compare different theoretical models of fatigue that contained different of those different elements and different parameters that I mentioned before. And I'm showing here is the AIC, and a lower AIC means a better fit to people's choices. And what you can see is the best fitting model is one that contains that unrecoverable component and the two parameters of that recoverable fatigue component. So people's effort-based decisions were actually constantly fluctuating over the course of the experiment, in line with our hypothesized model of fatigue. Participants, as we like to, did this whilst inside an MRI scanner. And so what we can do is look at activity that's time-locked to those the choices and see whether we can find variation in subjective value according to the model, but also see if we can find evidence of those fluctuating fatigue components. And in short, what we found was that there are regions that, in parts of the anterior cingulate cortex and the left middle frontal gyrus, which reflected those two different components of fatigue. In the dark blue is areas in which activity just simply built with that unrecoverable fatigue component over the experiment. And in the cyan blue there, you can see that activity that was fluctuating with the recoverable fatigue. So activity here increasing when you put in some effort on previous trials and decreasing after you've taken a rest. So that suggests that these regions might, although they're involved in effort-based decision, they're actually involved in tracking internal states about your level of fatigue. And what we then found was that in these fronto-striatal areas, so in this frontal pole region here and in the ventral striatum, we found activity that was reflective of the subjective value according to the model. Now, of course, within this model, subjective value isn't like other experiments. It's not static. It's constantly changing based on the reward and the efforts on offer, but also based on the recoverable and unrecoverable fatigue components. So activity in these regions doesn't just reflect subjective value, it reflects subjective value right now. How willing am I to put in this effort for this reward as a function of how fatigued I feel at this moment in time? Okay, so I think that's about it. So just to summarize, what I've been doing is trying to talk you through some of my work on the neural-computational mechanisms of effort. What I've shown you is that rewards are discounted by efforts. They can be discounted by different efforts using different kind of computations. But despite that, there's a domain general system that's involved in making decisions about whether it is worth exerting effort or reward. This system, though, does change your motivation from moment to moment, as it with parts of this system fluctuating based on your levels of fatigue. But there is an area of the brain that I've always been somewhat passionate about, which has a somewhat socially specialized role that's involved in both tracking other people's motivation and perhaps in translating that into motivation to do benefit for other people. There are way too many people to thank who've contributed to all of this work and to all of my achievements in my career. and they're really responsible for why I'm standing here giving a prize talk. But particularly, I'd like to thank Narinder Ramnani, Manos Sakiris, and Masood Hussain, who nominated me for this award, for all of their support and listening to this guy talking about computational models when it wasn't cool. I'd like to thank all of my collaborators. I can't thank them all, but I'd like to note particularly those 4 people there. And I'd like to thank all of the people who are currently or formerly been in my lab, who are really responsible for pushing a lot of this work forward. I'd like to thank you all for listening.